We start in Iran, where protests over the rising cost of living are spreading amid an economic crisis.
Iran, the central bank chief there, has resigned as the country's economic crisis continues to deepen.
Iran is facing an escalation of protests. Protests continue in over 100 settlements where people have risen up for freedom. However, in the heart of Tehran, there is a fire that is far more insidious and dangerous than the flames in the streets. These anti-regime marches, spreading wave after wave across 30 provinces, have today revealed a very critical and painful truth to the Iranian people. While the Iranian people are literally putting their lives on the line in the squares, allegations that the Khamenei regime is busy emptying the country's treasury through the back door have created a shock effect that changes the entire equation. One of Iran's largest and most established private banks has declared bankruptcy. On one side, the people are struggling for their lives. On the other, there is talk of $5.2 billion that has vanished into thin air. Today on Mr. Warlog, we go behind the scenes. We will lay out the details of the billion-dollar unsecured loans distributed through the regime's bankrupt treasury, Ayande Bank, the tons of gold allegedly smuggled to Russia by Khamenei, and the horrific details contained in the secret collapse documents leaked from the central bank. Before delving into the details of this grand heist, the first thing we need to see are reports that more than 50 banks and state institutions across the country were torched or damaged while the regime was counting its money and gold behind the scenes. Among the damaged structures are Bank Keshavarzi, an agricultural bank allegedly linked to the Revolutionary Guards, Bank Karafaran, an entrepreneurial bank, Bank Saman, and Bank Etisad Novin, a new economy bank. The public was likely reacting very harshly to the regime's mismanagement and its meddling in the country's banking and financial sector. However, rather than being ashamed of this response from the Iranian people, the Tehran regime chose, as mentioned, a management style so bad and greedy that it would drive the country's banks into bankruptcy. This is precisely where Ayande Bank, the financial center of the scandal, comes into play. Ayande Bank, marketed by the regime under the guise of private banking, was actually a massive money laundering and wealth transfer mechanism set up for the Revolutionary Guards and the regime's elite. This mechanism fell apart during the critical period when protests shook Iran. The dark days of January 2026, which plunged the country into a total crisis, were triggered by the official bankruptcy of Ayande Bank. Let me emphasize this. This was not an ordinary bank failure or a typical bankruptcy. The bank's coffers were empty. The money that the people had saved from their hard-earned income, a total of $5.2 billion, had vanished into thin air and flowed directly into the pockets of the regime's elite. The massive $2.9 billion debt shown on the bank's balance sheet was actually just the tip of the iceberg. When the bank's assets were transferred to the state-owned Melli Bank by decision of the central bank, the horrific picture inside came to light. The bank had been operating for years like a Ponzi scheme. Payments were made to old investors with new deposits, but the real big funds were being poured into projects with no return. As our analysis deepened, the question of where these funds went led us to the regime's shadiest figures. Businessmen linked to the regime, such as Ali Ansari, who appeared to be the bank's owner, were actually just fronts. Data shows that over 70% of the bank's loans were transferred directly to companies associated with the bank, primarily massive and potentially non-recoverable construction projects like Iran Mall. Do you know what's even more alarming? 98% of the loans the bank issued were non-performing loans, meaning they were in default. In a healthy banking system, this ratio should not exceed 5%. However, the regime distributed a total of $1.3 billion in loans to 61 individuals without any collateral. These 61 individuals were not ordinary business people. They were key figures in the regime, the military command, and the bureaucracy, or their proxies. While the people were suffering under inflation, these elites had emptied the bank through unsecured loans and had already transferred the money to offshore accounts or real estate. This is described by the Iranian people as, literally, an inside job. As the financial and monetary crisis scenario deepens in Iran, our technical investigation leads us to a much more critical document, a leaked, highly confidential directive from the Central Bank of Iran. This directive, leaked around January 2, 2026, and marked confidential, suggested that the regime knew its end was near. This document may not be a routine security procedure, but rather a shelter protocol prepared for the impending disaster. According to this document, the Central Bank of Iran allegedly instructed all banks to switch to emergency mode. What did these instructions include? They ordered the transfer of critical financial data to secure locations, the activation of backup power systems against internet and power outages, and most importantly, the preparation of alternative payment networks in case the regime lost control. The document clearly admitted that the regime was simulating its own collapse and preparing for it. Combined with the alleged regime budget went to war, notes left at ATMs on the streets, and rumors of cyber attacks, the banking system effectively shut down. However, the most striking and darkest aspect of the investigation is not on the ground, but in the sky. While the financial system was being undermined from within, radar data and air traffic records tell us a completely different story, a story of escape. Between December 27, 2025, and January 1, 2026, Russian Il-76TD cargo planes, masked with civilian codes, established a veritable air bridge between Tehran and Mineralny Vody. These planes were not flying randomly. Aviation data shows that these planes were operating according to military logistics doctrine, based on the principle of maximum load, minimum waiting time. Statements by British MP Tom Tugendhat and intelligence reports confirm this. These planes brought weapons and ammunition to Tehran, while taking off with suspiciously heavy loads on their return flights. So what were these heavy loads? Claims that these loads were Iran's national treasure, gold reserves, and cash foreign currency may be decoding the regime's Plan B. Just like Bashar al-Assad did, are Khamenei and his inner circle smuggling everything of value to Russia from the sinking ship? The fact that these flights are avoiding NATO airspace and flying over the Caucasus may indicate that this is a pre-planned evacuation operation. According to Belarusian opposition media, while the regime elites distract the people on the streets with the foreign powers fairy tale, they have already begun the plan to transfer the country's future to Moscow in the form of pallets full of gold. Those digital transactions emptying Hyundai Bank and those cargo planes flying to Moscow are not just numbers. The shockwave created by this corruption network has reached the market stalls in the remotest corners of Iran, the tables of the poor, and the anger in the streets. The economic indicators turning red have gone beyond being a statistic on the field and have become a survival issue that directly threatens people's lives. As of January 2026, the Iranian rial has seen its biggest devaluation in history, reaching 1.4 million against the dollar. This is not the currency becoming worthless, but the currency losing its meaning. Inflation exceeding 50% completely destroyed the purchasing power of the people. The impact of this economic crisis has caused a major breakdown not only in neighborhoods, but also among the bazaar merchants, on whom the regime traditionally relies. Merchants in the Grand Bazaar of Tehran, Tabriz, Mashhad, and Isfahan have closed their shops. Those familiar with history will recall that in Iranian history, a bazaar strike has always been a harbinger of major revolutions. The economic power that overthrew the Shah in 1979 is now targeting Khamenei with "death to the dictator" slogans. Merchants who say, "closing our shops is our last resort," are actually trying to cut off the regime's means of exploiting trade revenues, refusing to pay taxes, refusing to pay bills, and crippling the economy. This wave of civil disobedience, if you recall, resembles Ruhollah Khomeini's 1980 tactic of "paralyze the economy," given to the Iraqi people, now ironically being used against the regime he himself established. So history repeats itself with cruel irony. To stop this massive wave of anger, the regime resorted to the method it knows best, its strategy of shutting down communication. The Tehran regime planned to carry out its massacres in the dark by pulling the internet plug. However, this move was thwarted by a technological counterattack. Elon Musk's decision to activate his Starlink satellites for free for protesters in Iran ensured an uninterrupted flow of information. The images of the crowds in Tehran's Zafaraniya district broke through the regime's wall of censorship. Now, no crime remains hidden. The regime's inhumane orders of oppression, the threats broadcast on television, even in those moments, people are live streaming the atrocities to the world with their phones. The ripple effect of this process, which restored communication and, albeit limited, internet access, transcended geographical boundaries. We see that the protests spreading from Tehran have intensified significantly in Mashhad, the country's holiest city. There are claims that protesters have taken control of Mashhad, considered the ideological stronghold of the regime, and that security forces are confined to government buildings. It is noteworthy that Baluchi women in Zahedan chanted, "Pahlavi will return," while people in Karaj in the north shouted, "Our country will not exist unless the mullahs leave." Furthermore, the fact that Iran's ethnic and sectarian fault lines have united against the regime as one fist is seen as a complete nightmare for Khamenei. Even though the regime deploys its repressive apparatus, the Basij, funded by oil money, cracks are beginning to appear even within those security forces whose salaries are unpaid and whose futures have been stolen. So, up to this point, we see a regime facing not only street clashes, but also a shock in the form of betrayal by its own elites. Khamenei's axis of resistance strategy has failed due to the escape plans of those who manage that very axis. The most critical indicator in this process is the phenomenon of abandoning ship. Allegations that the families of the regime's top figures, former President Hassan Rouhani and Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf, are knocking on Europe's doors have intensified. These elites, lining up to apply for visas to the West, to France and Germany, reinforce the possibility of ideological bankruptcy. Those who preach martyrdom to their own people are planning a luxurious life of exile for themselves in Parisian cafes. This is the clearest picture of the regime's backbone breaking from within, of loyalty disappearing. Khamenei's move towards Russia is the final act in this strategic collapse. The Ayatollah may share Assad's fate in the historical memory. The gold allegedly smuggled to Russia and the possible asylum plan may indicate that Khamenei has lost faith in his future in Iran. If these claims are true, Moscow is not there to protect Khamenei, but probably to suck up Iran's last remaining resources. This situation could reduce Khamenei, in the eyes of Iranian nationalists and even some elements within the regime, from a leader to a collaborator who is handing over his country to a foreign power. Trump's sarcastic but intelligence-based comment that Khamenei is planning to go somewhere suggests that Washington is aware of this escape plan and is closely monitoring the process. It is not normal for voices to be raised on this issue from all sides. Therefore, Khamenei may be both besieged by his own people at home and at the mercy of Russia, his safe haven abroad. In addition to the Iranian regime's loss of power, we must also add innovations in the social media arena. The X platform's consideration of removing the Iranian flag emoji, one of the regime's symbols, and replacing it with the lion and sun, the flag of the former monarchy, symbolizes the shift of legitimacy in the digital world. The rejection that began with slogans in the streets such as "Khamenei is like Khomeini" turned into a search for an alternative, with calls to Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi to "Give us your orders, Prince." Pahlavi's call to the international community to break the silence, and his thanks to Trump, show that the Iranian opposition has emerged from its fragmented state and evolved into a legitimate political alternative that can coordinate with the West. As the regime transforms the concept of the religious leader's velayat in the minds of the people from a sacred form of government into a tyranny imposed as the essence of religion, the people cling more tightly to their secular, nationalist, and historical roots. This is not merely a demand for a change in power. It is a wholesale rejection of the 1979 revolution and a desire for historical renewal and modernization. In short, the final picture of what is happening in Iran is becoming clearer. The sound of Russian cargo planes' engines in the skies over Tehran may actually be the death knell of an era. Khamenei and his entourage may have begun to load Iran's future onto the cargo holds of those planes and flee, just as they stole its past. But there is one thing those on the regime's side have forgotten. You cannot fit the spirit of a nation into suitcases. The empty vaults of Ayande Bank and the crowded squares of Tehran's streets scream one truth. The wall of fear has been completely demolished. Khamenei's alleged Plan B, a ticket to Moscow, may be his personal salvation. But it seems his own people have decided that the regime he established is on the verge of collapse. Iranians prefer to be reborn under the lion and the sun, not just for bread, but to reclaim their stolen honor. And this time, there is nowhere left to run, no safe left to hide in. So I guess the game is over for Khamenei. What do you think about this? Can the Iranian people reclaim the wealth of their country, which is said to have been stolen? Or will Khamenei start a new life in Moscow with his gold? Let's meet in the comments. Stay tuned for the truth on Mr. Warlog.